Good morning. Today we're going to be talking about the book of Joshua, and in this discussion, I want to first of all define what it is that we're looking at. Which literary tradition in the Old Testament is Joshua associated with, and when do we think it was written, and for what purpose? Second, I want to talk about the various historical theories behind the emergence of Israel and give you a little bit of vocabulary to help you understand this very interesting topic. Basically, we know that before a certain point there was no Israel, and then after a certain point there was Israel. So, what was that process? How long did it take? And what regions did it begin in? And what were the various factors that led to the development of Israel as we know it? And we'll end by thinking about the nature of the literature itself, especially from a theological point of view. And we'll be talking about these things more in class directly on Monday. Well, Joshua is the first part of a larger complex of material that scholars sometimes call the Deuteronomistic History. These books include Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Samuel and Kings, of course, being so long that they get divided up into two scrolls, first and second, first and second. But scholars believe that Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, despite a complicated internal history of editing, is part of one larger collection of material that seems to reflect, this, in its final form at least, one coherent theological and historical situation. Now, it's called the Deuteronomistic History because it is also theorized that the people who created this historical collection of materials, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, are the same people behind the book of Deuteronomy. The reason for that are two. One, the language is very similar. There seems to be a similar kind of Hebrew a lot of times. This is sometimes called Deuteronomistic Hebrew. There seems to be a certain style that is running all the way through that is in the same in Deuteronomy and also in Joshua and following. But even more importantly is theological. So in the book of Deuteronomy, as we'll see, there is a theological idea called the covenant, sometimes called the Mosaic covenant. And the basic idea in the Mosaic covenant is that God has made an agreement with the Israelites and has charged them to, in this agreement, follow certain laws, to live into a certain vision for their communal life together. And in response, in exchange for their continued obedience, they will remain in relationship with God. And because of that, God will then bless them with life and health and security and well-being and prosperity and families and crops and the whole deal. But the thing that they receive most powerfully, and the thing that's the foundation, or maybe it's the thing you have to have any of those other things, is the land itself. And so in the book of Deuteronomy, it says that God is giving the land to the Israelites, and as long as they maintain their covenantal connection, their covenantal bond with God, and follow all of God's laws and stipulations, then they will be able to remain in the land. So that theology seems to go all the way through from Joshua into the end of 2 Kings. And in a way, we talked about the periods of Israel's history in the previous class, and in a way, this whole story is a story of exile. It's a story of losing the land. So scholars have argued, and scholars disagree on this point, but a lot of scholars argue that the Deuteronomistic history as we have it seems to reflect the theological and historical perspective of the exile. So the members of Judah, the citizens of Judah and Jerusalem who have been taken into Babylon as part of the Babylonian exile are now sitting there and wondering, asking themselves the question, what the heck? What just happened? And the combination of the covenant and Deuteronomy and the story of Israel's founding and monarchy and the destruction of both Israel and Judah, northern and southern kingdoms, ending with the Babylonian exile, is a story of them failing to keep the covenant and then thereby being punished by God for failing to keep the covenant and in the end losing the land. Now, as we're going to see, there is a complicated way of thinking about the exile that includes God's judgment for Israel's sins and God's eventual plan for restoration, for salvation, for bringing them back from exile and giving them the land again. And so the overall perspective of the Deuteronomistic history then, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, is this. We receive the land because God gave it to us as a gift, as part of the covenant. We kept it as long as we were obedient to God's commands. And in the end, when we were disobedient to God's commands, then we lost the land. And here we are in Babylon, and what's going to happen next? And if we turn to God, if we trust in God, then we believe that God will turn back to us and return us back to our land. We'll talk about that part later on. So the first point I want to make is that Joshua is one part of a larger theological-based history of Israel from Joshua through Kings, which is a demonstration. It is written for the purpose of making the argument that Israel received the land from God as part of a gift in the midst of the covenant and lost the land because of their disobedience to God. Now, if that's the theological explanation, what are some other possible explanations? In other words, what would a historian say? What would a political scientist say? What might an archaeologist or anthropologist say about the development of Israel and its rise and its fall? And those are more complicated, different kinds of explanations. Well, scholars have been studying the question of the emergence of Israel for over 150 years by even going to the land of Israel and digging up various archaeological sites and trying to figure out when did Israel emerge, where did Israel emerge, what's the history, the actual history of this, separated from the theological version found in the Bible. Well, there are classically in the field three major ways of thinking about the emergence of Israel. One is the so-called conquest theory. In the conquest theory, the most common version of the conquest theory accepts more or less at face value the history as is found in the Torah and in the book of Joshua, which says that Israel came in from the outside as a big group, and over a period of time, maybe not quite as thoroughly or as quickly as it is suggested in Joshua, they conquered the land of Canaan, dispatched their Canaanite enemy residents, and set up their new society. And that's the version that's found in the book of Joshua, where there are three different waves of military activity in the north and the south and the central regions where Israel conquers the Canaanite enemies. And the second half of the book of Joshua, which I didn't have you read, is basically them counting themselves, adding themselves up, and dividing the land among them. And so when you get to the end of Joshua in chapter 24, which you did read, they are affirming the covenant. They have been given the land, they've conquered the land, and it ends with a kind of celebration of Israel's success in taking the land from the Canaanites. There are archaeologically some bits of evidence to support the notion of military conflict in this time period. If you remember from our conversation before, the date we're talking about is starting around 1200 and going to about 1000. And in the early Iron Age, starting around 1200, there are some archaeological remains that suggest there was military conflict that might support a conquest theory. Well, starting in the early 20th century, another theory developed that took, especially in Germany, where this theory is, instead of seeing Israel as one unified group just moving in at the same time and taking military action, it was rather the idea of gradual infiltration. The idea is that the Israelites coming into the land were actually nomads filtering in over a long period of time and settling in particular valleys and highland areas that were previously unoccupied. So that theory, which began in the 1920s under Albrecht Alt, existed because of his analysis of the Hebrew text. But starting in the 1970s and 80s, archaeologists began to discover what we call the Highland villages. Now, the Highland villages, I'm going to show you on the accordance map here. If I show you the region of Israel and Judah, which is right in here, notice the green is low-lying areas. That is where the Bronze Age, the Canaanite city-states were found. That's where the big cities were. You see them some on here: Megiddo, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gaza, Ekron, right? These are some of the big Canaanite cities. But this brown region right here is called the Central Highlands, and it was not occupied during the Bronze Age. And so archaeologists began to discover settlements in this Central Highlands area, and they are called by scholars the Highland villages, which seem to be Israelite settlements dating from about 1200 to 1000. And so scholars have found archaeological evidence to support the idea that the Israelites came in a more disconnected way and settled in various areas in the highlands rather than conquering the city-states. Instead, they settled in the highland villages, and there were monumental population changes and societal changes that caught up everyone in the region, so that from the Bronze Age into the Iron Age, you see the city-state system collapsing, and then in its place, this series of nation-states. So all these various nations that developed around Israel, Judah, Edom, Moab, Ammon, Aram, Phoenicia, Philistia, they are developing national identity in the Iron Age, in the centuries after the collapse of the Canaanite city-state system, and Israel is one of those groups. So there has been, again, archaeological evidence to support the idea that instead of being one massive group that came at one time and conquered city-states through military action, that they were a bunch of smaller groups that filtered in as part of a larger region-wide population shift that settled in previously unoccupied areas, and over time the Canaanite states faded away, and then they became the seed for the nation of Israel that was going strong by the year 1000 maybe. So both of those theories, the conquest model and the gradual infiltration model, have in common the idea that Israel's from the outside. Well, the fact is that there is a fair amount of material continuity between the Canaanites and the Israelites. In other words, the people that Israel displaced seem to have been related to them materially and culturally. Similar building techniques, similar pottery techniques, similar religious structures, the language is connected. And so what about the idea that Israel is not an outside group at all? And so there's a third model, sometimes called the revolt model or the peasant revolt model, the revolution model, which suggests that Israel emerged not as a group coming from the outside, but rather due to internal changes in Canaanite society. So in the original form of this was very idealistic, this idea that the peasants in the Canaanite system said, screw this, we're done with these Canaanite overlords, we're going to move ourselves into the highlands and start a new egalitarian society, and that was the foundation for Israel. I think that's probably a little romantic in nature, but it does seem that there were tremendous Canaanite influences on these settlements that became Israel, and so we have to say that it is very likely that a big part of Israel's developing society was based upon and created by the people who were originally part of the Canaanite system that came before. Well, how do we get the Exodus then? Where does this idea that they came in from the outside come from? Well, maybe there was a small group. Maybe there was one group who came from Egypt or who experienced something like an Exodus. And then that idea, the idea that God has set us free from our bondage in Egypt, becomes what we might call an umbrella metaphor that everyone buys into, the same way that we all in America celebrate Thanksgiving, even though a very small number of us are actually descendant from the Thanksgiving people to the extent to which that's a historically accurate story. But Thanksgiving as an idea becomes a metaphor that all or most Americans celebrate, even though that they might not be historically related to it. So maybe Exodus is like that. Maybe it's something that they affirmed as a group because it communicates a very powerful idea, which is that God gave us this land and we're dependent upon God's gift in order to hold it. So those are the first two sections. The idea that Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings is part of a larger collection called the Deuteronomistic History that has theological purpose, that scholars disagree about how to interpret the historical evidence to suggest when and where and how and why did Israel come together. But I think I can give you a general statement, which I think is true, that incorporates elements of a lot of these, which is that Israel began starting around the year 1200. It began in the central highland areas here in the central part of Israel, and was a combination probably of internal shifts in Canaanite society and shifts in population that brought people from the outside, from the nomadic cultures, and caused them to settle down and begin basic farming economies and shepherding economies rather than being nomads. And that over a 200-year period, we go from there's no Israel to now there is a budding Israel, which has a growing sense of identity that is uniting all of these various groups, which were originally separate. And that by the time we get into the 10th century, into the 900s, they are starting to ask themselves, what's next? And that's where we get into the monarchy. Okay, so in the third part of this lecture, I want to turn specifically to the story of Joshua and the Battle of Jericho as an example of this topic that I've already been discussing. So this is a famous story. Maybe you've heard the song Joshua Fought the Battle of Jericho or sung it at camp. Maybe you're familiar with the Veggie Tales, Joshua fighting the Battle of Jericho against the Canaanite milkshakes, little peas. I don't remember the Canaanites, It's a very famous story because it's very sort of shocking what happens in the story. As a recap, which God tells Israel, I'm going to give Jericho to you. And he says, I want you to march around the city for 6 days. And in the seventh day, you will march around 7 times. And you blow the trumpets. And then the walls are going to fall. And then the people will be able to run in and destroy the Canaanites. Notice what's happening in this passage. It's being led by the priests. The instruments that they are playing, the horn, trumpet, these are religious, ritual-associated instruments. What are they doing here in this passage? When God tells them to march around the city, they're not performing a military maneuver. This is a worship service. And in fact, that's what happens. God tells them what to do. They do it. They are marching around the city and led by priests, engaging in this worship processional. And when they blow the horns, the walls fall down, and then the Israelites are able to take the city and kill all the Canaanites. So, what is the point of this passage? The point of this passage is not that Israel conquered Jericho through its military might, not through conquest. This is not a conquest. Israel conquered Jericho by obeying God's instructions. They obeyed God's instructions, and God gave them the city. Later on, when they disobey, when Achan takes some treasure instead of giving all of the treasure to the Lord, then they lose the battle. And then they have to find out why, punish that guy, and then go back and win the battle. So both in Joshua and in Judges, there is a very clear correlation between we are listening to God's word and prospering, we are diverting from God's word and failing. So this is not fundamentally historical. I don't think the story of Jericho happened as it's said here. At the time that this story is set in the year 1200, Jericho didn't have walls, right? This seems to be a traditional story meant to make a theological point, which is that we have this land because God gave it to us. And when we disobey God, we should not be surprised then that the land is taken away from us. So I want to call your attention finally to chapter 24, which is the reaffirming of the covenant. And you'll see it's the same idea. It's very clear where God says, I gave you the land. This is land that you had not been labored on. I gave you towns that you had not built. You ate the fruit of vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant. Right? God gave them the land. They did not take the land. So now serve God in sincerity. Put away your false gods. Make a choice. And so this choice, which is set up at the very beginning of Joshua, then is the fundamental theological idea that describes the whole of the Deuteronomistic history. And the people who are writing this, the people who are applying this not only or even primarily to their history, but rather applying it to their present circumstances, are the Judean exiles in Babylon. So we'll pick this up some in our class discussion. So I'll see you soon.